After a few days on a sunny day, Tutor, Sancho, and Piggy also finished the tasks and went out to the yard to play with the children. Everyone was very happy. A little while later, Tutor, who was wiping the sweat from his forehead with his hand, started to look at the children and with a smile mentioned that today was the last day of volunteering. Sancho, who had one hand on his waist, began to smile and with a cheerful look replied that time had passed very quickly. Meanwhile, on the other side, Piggy, who was very tired and panting heavily, remained silent. Tutor clenched his fist, raised it to the sky, and decided to play until he ran out of energy. Next to them was the tree where Victor was sitting. He intertwined his hands and remained thinking in silence. Next to him sat Perry. While the sun was illuminating the area, Victor began to gaze at the ground with a lost look. Perry, who was sitting next to him, was holding something made of flowers. Her gaze was filled with sadness as today was our boy's last day of volunteering. Perry was red and sad at the same time. She lifted her head and started observing Victor in silence. Victor raised his head and with a serious look began to think of some way to kill that bastard Dentalian. While he was distracted, Perry approached him and without making a sound, she placed the flower crown on Victor's head. Upon feeling this, he came out of his thoughts and couldn't help but be somewhat surprised. He started to touch his head with his hand, and with a confused look asked if this was a crown. Upon hearing this, Perry panicked, began to sweat, and with a surprised look started to shake her hands in denial. She approached him and took his hand. Upon feeling this, Victor became even more confused as he didn't know what she wanted to do. She took our boy's hand with one hand and using the finger of the other began to write on the palm of his hand, thanking him for everything. Victor started to observe her, and his eyes filled with surprise. Today was a wonderful day. Perry thanked our boy for always being with her and for finding the ball. Victor replied that it was not necessary to thank him since he simply enjoyed doing it. At that moment, Perry moved her hand away and started thinking for several seconds. Then she wrote again on the palm of our boy's hand with her finger. After doing this, she moved her hands away, brought them close to her chest, and with a sad look asked if they were going to see each other again someday. Victor's gaze also filled with sadness. He began to remember what Dolores had told him about her. A few days ago, when Victor ran into her, she started touching her cheek with her finger and with a sincere expression explained that at first everyone was friendly with her. But after a few days everyone was so busy that they couldn't even come to see her. She was tired of the temporary affection and the long separations. Perry sat back down, rested her hands on her abdomen and began to look at the ground with a gaze full of sadness. While our boy was hunting demons, he had to be prepared for death at all times. He could not promise that he would return. But still he answered that they were going to see each other again. Upon hearing this, Perry lifted her head and her eyes filled with happiness. While the wind was blowing the leaves, with a sincere look, Victor promised that as long as there was a tomorrow for him, he would come here. Perry began to watch him and fell silent. She couldn't believe that Victor had promised her this. She closed her eyes and started to show a happy smile. Thanking our boy, she decided to wait for that day eagerly. After this, both remained contemplating the views in silence for several minutes. Several hours later, in the main auditorium of the Independencia orphanage, all the students who had come to volunteer gathered together. Among them were Sancho, Piggy, Tutor, and Bianca. Someone thanked everyone since for the children who had been separated from their parents and lived in the orphanage this was priceless. By knowing them, the children had felt their parents' presence and had been able to fill the void they had in their hearts. These words made everyone start to cry. The person who was thanking them was Quilty. He extended his hands to the sides, closed his eyes, and with a smile explained that if the children grew up well it would be thanks to the wonderful volunteers. At that moment, a worker who was pushing a box of donations appeared and began to approach them. Quilty extended his hand towards the box and with a kind smile asked them to share with the children the love they had felt for them over the last 10 days. Upon hearing this, Piggy put his hands over his eyes and began to cry even more out of sadness. Next to him was Victor, whose eyes filled with surprise upon seeing that Quilty had attended. Victor started to touch his glasses and thought that this bastard was good at giving thanks with the tongue of the devil, appropriately subtly stimulating respect and a sense of debt towards the parents. He knew they were planning for the young students to donate to the orphanage. Next to Quilty were his 4 subordinates, who now had human faces. They simply remained silent. Quilty began to show a kind smile. Now that the 4 were here, it was going to be complicated to carry out an incursion. Victor started to stare intently at Quilty with a penetrating look and decided not to let this guy do whatever he wanted. With a smile, Quilty began to persuade the students to donate to the orphanage. All preparations had been completed and today Victor was going to hunt one of the 10 elite corpses as planned. Quilty's persuasion plan worked as the students began donating gold coins. A long line formed in front of the donation box. Everyone was happy to donate, even Piggy, Tudor, Bianca, and Sancho. Victor did not get in line, and upon seeing this, Sinclair approached him, called him brother, put her hand over her mouth, and with a confused look she asked if he was not going to donate, to which he replied that he had no money. She was somewhat surprised and asked why he had no money, being a student of the academy. The real reason behind this was that he did not want to give money to a demon. Victor began to observe the others and with a calm expression asked why she was calling him brother. She approached him and with a smile reminded him that he had said that she had to call him something else. According to her, it was too cold not to donate money since they were rich, so they should help the children of the orphanage even if it was just a little. Victor started staring at Quilty and explained that there was no need for parents since anyway, the world was a place where one had to overcome it on their own. Parents were only necessary during childhood when the help of others was essential, and apart from that, according to our boy, they were not needed. Upon hearing this, Sinclair's gaze filled with concern. She began to look at Victor and fell silent. She took Victor's hand with both hands and with a sincere look realized that he had been through a very difficult time. Feeling this, Victor's eyes filled with confusion as he did not know what she was doing. With a tender look, she took Victor's hand and asked him to come visit her house later to eat together with her family during the holidays or vacations. After saying this, she turned her back to him and ran away, saying that for today she was done, with the excuse that she was going to see the children, asking him to make sure to take time after his volunteer work. Victor began to look at her and remained thinking in silence. He brought his hand close to his face, started observing it, and with a perplexed look thought that she was a very strange person. Sinclair approached the children and with a kind smile began to pet their heads with her hand. Victor realized that the identity she had sent to the academy was false. Before his regression, she had been the top genius of the class and had never lost first place in written and practical exams during 4 years, but for some reason, she disappeared as soon as after graduating, and the reason was never revealed to the world. All the children began to approach the students with happiness to give them a hug. Quilty, who was on the first floor, extended his hands to the sides and mentioned that from now on, they were going to take the time to thank the parents who had been with their children for the last 10 days. Tudor hugged a child, closed his eyes and started crying out of sadness, and swore to visit him every week until the day he became a great hero, and of course he was going to keep doing it after that. Sancho bent down, rested a hand on a child's shoulder, started stroking his head, and with a sincere look mentioned that in the north, the children, the young people who were going to lead the future, were the most beloved, saying that the future of the empire depended on him, asking him to work hard. 3 children approached Piggy. He extended his hands towards them and began to cry, promising that he was going to come back and was going to bring a lot of delicious food next time. Bianca started to stroke the head of a girl who was crying, and her eyes also filled with tears. For her, the 10 days had finally passed very quickly. She had become very attached to this girl. While everyone was saying goodbye to the children, Victor stayed watching in silence. With a curious look, he began to look one way, and then the other. In front of him was Dolores, who was stroking the heads of 2 children. Victor approached her and called her attention, and upon hearing his voice, her eyes filled with surprise. She did not know what was happening. She turned her head back and began to blush at the thought of Victor. She started to remember Victor when he had taken the ball out of the estuary. She did not know why this image kept coming to her mind. With a serene look, Victor said that he had a question. He began to observe her and asked if she had seen Perry. She started looking at Victor and remained thinking in silence. She put her hand on her cheek, looked away, and replied that she could not see Perry around the area. For her, this was strange since she had seen her that morning. Upon knowing this, Victor's eyes filled with alertness and rage. He knew something bad had happened. Seeing that even she did not know, Victor turned his back to her and as he was walking away said that he had to go. Dolores reached out to him and could not help but feel somewhat confused. Victor began to remember Perry's happy smile and could not help but wonder why she had not appeared. His eyes were filled with rage. He stopped walking and turned his head back and his gaze fixed on Quilty. Quilty began to stare at Victor and started to show a smile. Seeing his expression, Victor realized that this bastard was responsible for Perry's disappearance. After a few hours, night fell and the sky filled with clouds which began to cover the moon. At the same time, in the room for the volunteer work, Sancho and Tudor were sleeping like a log on wooden beds. Tudor was dreaming of the orphanage. He did not want to leave here. Next to them there was another bed. The person who was sleeping in it took off the sheet and got up. At the same time, in the 4th building of the orphanage Indulgencia known as the children's dormitory, Quilty's subordinates arrived. all carrying weapons and ready to act. Without making a sound, the four began to walk, taking different paths. The dorm had 4 hallways, and the four took one hallway and started to walk. Several seconds later, Efibo moved quite far from the area. It was night and the hallway behind him was very dark. Efibo remained silent. And at that moment, Vikir, who wore the Night Hound mask, appeared from among the darkness and began to stare intently at Efibo, who was distracted. He did not take long to feel Vikir's presence and quickly turned around. But to his surprise, Vikir disappeared. Efibo's eyes filled with alertness. He knew that someone was following him. When he turned to the front, there was Vikir. With a penetrating look, he said that he had a question. Upon seeing him, Efibo couldn't help but be somewhat surprised since he didn't know what was happening. Vikir asked where the children were who were locked up for the purpose of being the food supply for the demon. Upon hearing this, Efibo drew his mace and prepared to attack. He knew that this was not good at all. Using all his strength, he swung the mace forcefully towards Vikir. As little by little the attack was getting closer, Vikir began to stare intently at Efibo and fell silent. Just before he could make another move, Vikir moved at inhuman speed, and in the blink of an eye, cut off Efibo's head. Vikir grabbed Efibo's lifeless head by the hair and realized that this bastard could not speak. Vikir unsheathed the sword Beelzebub, causing the blade to begin to emit a demonic energy. He started to observe the blade, and upon seeing that this bastard did not want to talk, he decided not to waste any more of his time playing with him. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.